Hey, Bob. How are you, man? Thanks for being on the
I'm
show.
awesome, man. I'm awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Kate actually recently discovered your podcast and has been binging season one.
I
Awesome.
haven't
Yeah.
getting
I
through it.
love hearing that. As fellow creators, there's nothing sweeter to your ears than hearing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what it's all about.
And that's the thing. It's like you never know how you find these shows. I mean, Kate's really into true crime. I mean,
Oh yeah, I loved it as soon as I started listening. I can't remember how I found it, but I was like, "There's unheard Gacy stuff." I was like, I've got to get into this." And then the other thing I really love about your podcast is not just Gacy. It's like
Yeah.
you're getting like because I'm into true crime. I like to think like everyone does. I'm like, oh, I know a bit about lawyering. It's like
Right.
no, I actually know nothing about lawyering.
Yeah, that was kind of the thing going in, because like Gacy had been like this weird part of my life for, since I was 10, like whenever my dad picked that case up. And so it's always just kind of been there, like kind of omnipotently hanging around in my fucking brain and just a part of my life. And so when he gave me those tapes, I sat on them forever. I had no fucking idea what to do with them. And I had started tinkering because I fell in love with podcasting, and I've always been an auditory guy. Like I've always loved like AM radio and like talk radio and shit like that. I like listening to stories. It's always been like I prefer it to actually watching stories.
yeah.
So when I listen to Serial, like many of us like that, like in terms of true crime, I was like, fuck, man, this is awesome. Like I really I enjoyed it and I binged that like immediately. And then I kind of started diving in. And then I was a little disappointed because I didn't really find anything that kind of like hit me the same way that Serial did initially. Because it's like I like me personally, I enjoy like the serialized podcast. I like a long story where they're kind of diving into the
Like an
just all the
episodic.
details.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
to
do
me,
too.
that's so, ultimately what I decided, and I had tinkered with doing the pod like 4 years ago. And I'm like, fuck, I'm in the middle of like a law practice and my wife is my law partner. And, and going in, you have no fucking idea, how much work it is to do what we do. Like it's a massive amount of work, man. It's like, it's an unbelievable amount of work. And there's no, so I had this source material and I'm going into it thinking, well, maybe with the source material, I'll be able to like skip that step of having to put all the fucking work in and build the audience and all that shit. And it
No.
just doesn't work like that, dude. It
No,
just
it
Yeah.
not work.
doesn't.
Like as amazing as my source material was, is like I still have to,
You
do
still
what
got to
all
do
of
the
us have to
social
do as indie
media.
pods, man.
Yeah.
You got to fucking grow your show. That's it,
That's what you got to do.
So I got to. So I ended up I hit up my homie who is my EP. Uh and he's a sound engineer by trade.
Oh, wow.
But he was in the music industry and he was starving because of COVID. And I'm like, yo, man, I'm thinking about fucking around with this podcast. And he's like, well, I've never even listened to a podcast. I'm like, well, listen to one, because I need your help on this. So he's like, because I actually had hit him up. I'm like, hey, man, do you know how to work a DAW? And he's like, well, it's like, dude, that's what I use every fucking day of my life. So he's like, yes, I know how to work a DAW. So I said, look, would you be interested in doing this with me? And he's like, yeah, man, for sure. So I booked him a ticket. And then, creatively, we were just in like lockstep because I like going into the Gacy thing. I was like, I'm not going to make it about Gacy. Obviously I've got these tapes. Obviously I'm going to play as much of the tapes as I can because like that was my thing with the tapes. I wanted them to be public, but I wanted it to be on my terms where,
Of
like,
course.
cause I had let a deal, I killed a deal with Berlinger, the guy who just dropped that thing 3 weeks ago on Netflix, the Gacy thing.
Yeah.
We're
That
going to
Yeah.
was
talk
actually
about
my
that.
pitch.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we definitely want to get into that, and that's part of the reason why I'm also kind of enamored with your podcast because you're putting a new insight on
Right.
someone like John Wayne Gacy, which most people would never have that opportunity to do, and
Right.
partially because your father was his defense attorney, Bob Motta
Correct.
Sr.
Right.
That's so.
Yeah.
First question here: was he court appointed?
No.
Okay, so Gacy sought him out.
No, so there were two lawyers that handled the trial. It was Sam Amaranti and my father. So Sam had actually been doing like contractual type shit for Gacy, like for his contracting business, like if he had like
Oh
little
yeah,
beefs come
yeah.
up. And I think that Sam had like handled a couple of like some of Gacy's other like misdemeanor type battery type shit, which everybody looking back in retrospect was like a major red flag that, at that point in time, Chicago police just didn't give a fuck about.
No, no, so corrupt.
Because it was really the gay community and they just didn't give a shit about the gay community back then at all.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's a gay fight. We don't care,
Look at
because Gacy
Dahmer.
would just say, oh man, I'll just tell the cops it was consensual and they won't give a fuck. And he was exactly right. So like Sam ended up like, he was the first guy that Gacy hired. And then when the story broke, I happened to be visiting my father because my parents were divorced from Colorado. And on that night, and it was Christmas vacation for me, and I was like 10 or some shit. And the story broke, and my dad's like, holy shit, because Sam came on the news and like the night that it broke. And my dad's like, I know him. He's like, I wonder if I should reach out to him. And like, this is obviously before email and texting and all that shit, and see if he needs assistance with the case, because it was at that point, it still wasn't even clear how big this case was. Like the first night, it was like, I think they unearthed like 2 or 3 bodies. And then like over the next 4 months, like the count ends at 33.
Yeah, it blew up. They kept finding more bodies.
Oh my God, dude.
And then
it was like
national
never ending.
attention.
So like when my father got into it, he had no idea, what the magnitude of it was going to be, but he knew that it was a big enough case that Sam was going to need help. So my dad reached out to Sam. Sam immediately said yes, because my dad had literally just hung his shingle. He had been a public defender for 14 years prior to that, and had literally gone out on his own, like I think within like a month of that. So that was like kind of like his first case coming back, back into private practice. And so no, they were not court appointed. They were both retained by Gacy.
Wow.
Let's get back to your father's tapes. So your father, I'm assuming, if he's retired now, right?
I'd say 98% retired.
Okay.
Like he'll do like some one-off type stuff, but he's not practicing actively.
What was the deal? Was he like going cleaning up the basement? He's like, oh, I found these tapes of the interviews with John Wayne Gacy that I did. Here you go, son.
No, my dad's like a very nostalgic pack rat. Like anything that has any kind of value to him in terms of it being something that was significant in his life. Like he keeps shit. Like my dad's that kind of guy. Like every year, like he'll get me like a book. Like he'll get me like Attorney for the Damned by Clarence Darrow, and then inside of that, he'll put like 2 Polaroids that are like 30 years old of me when I was a kid. So he keeps shit like that. And so like he had these tapes, and like those were for him. He knew what the value of them was at the time. I mean, these were all his interviews with Gacy when they were preparing for trial. They were one of a kind. They were historic in that sense. And then, when it came to be clear, just the magnitude of that case, he knew what he had, but he held on to him, and I didn't know he had them. It wasn't like something he ever talked about. So on my 21st birthday, that's when he actually gave them to me. Like I kind of tell the story in the pod, and it's an absolutely true story. It was my 21st birthday. I was hoping for car keys, man, because I was driving around some beater, man, and he hands me this fucking shoebox, and I'm like, what is this? And, like right on the box, it just scrawled Gacy tapes. I open it up, and, there they were. And then I didn't know what to do with them, for years and years and years and years. So, I contemplated selling them. And, when I kind of discovered the podcasting, man, that was like the bell rang, and, a light bulb popped in my head, and I'm like, ooh, I think maybe that's the way to go.
Did your father approve of you playing these tapes on air? Like, did you have to, did you get his
so kind of the bigger question initially, like people were asking me, because like attorney-client privilege survives death. Okay?
That was my next question. I was wondering if it ends right after lethal injection.
Yeah, no, it survives death.
Okay.
But the thing is that Gacy had waived privilege way, way back when. Like the way that he was anticipating both Sam and my father actually getting paid was from the book or movie deal, because they ended up making like nothing on that case. They made like in today, like I think they each made like 23 grand on like a case that took like that shut their entire practices down and like ate up their entire, lives for like over a year, so they didn't make shit off of it. And, so Gacy waived privilege back then, knowing that these guys would be able to make a book or movie deal, in order to kind of get paid for the case. So like, I didn't have to worry about that. Like, I knew that the privilege had been waived. And I mean, there would have been an argument because I wasn't his attorney, so I didn't have the privilege issue, but I didn't want it to come back and bite my father in the ass. You know what I mean? Like somewhere down the road. But like when I found out that there was the waiver, I didn't have to worry about it at all.
Do you interview your father on the show?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. So
Like
he participates.
and it was funny, man. Going in, I'm like, oh man, I got my dad in my back pocket here. Like I'll have like hours and hours and hours of fucking like never ending amazing interviews with my dad. And he didn't fucking like he barely remembered anything. And so it's like I have him on there, but it's like it wasn't what I expected. But I was able to coax him into reading his entire opening statement, which is fucking incredibly moving.
Oh, that's
And it was
amazing.
like in its entirety. Like I do some things on my podcast that no one does in podcasts. Like I was able to get my dad to read his opening statement that he gave that
Wow.
only the people in the courtroom have ever heard. And it's fucking amazing. It's brilliant. And like when he gave it, he wasn't reading it. It's like when you listen to his words and you hear it in total, you can hear what a brilliant attorney he was back then. And then we end the entire series that I was able to coax Bill Kunkel, who was the lead prosecutor,
Yeah.
to read his entire closing argument, which took 4 hours to record. And we're like, fuck, like we can't put 4 hour closing on an episode. So we tailored very little of it. I mean, like I think we got it down to around 2 hours, but it was worth the ride. It's like it was amazing. Like for that type of case, for that case to be able to give the people like that kind of time machine to go
Exactly,
back
yeah.
and like pretend like you're sitting in that courtroom listening to that man say those words in that case, to me was fucking unbelievable. Like
I mean, it's a piece of history
Yeah,
that a lot of people would
exactly.
never be privy to. So, I
right.
mean, that's kind of
like
amazing.
literally the only people that have ever heard it were the people that were in that courtroom that day, like, so maybe 100 people on the planet and half of them are probably dead, so
I got to say, that's what Patreon's for, all the bonus content. Put like 4 hours
Right.
up on that.
Yeah.
exactly the whole fucking kit and caboodle on Patreon
So-
for sure.
Tell me about the deal with Netflix. So they're coming out with this documentary. Did you pitch your idea about Gacy like prior to this documentary that they did?
Oh yeah.
Like, how'd that work?
Yeah, that's my pitch. So the way that it worked 2019, like I had been tinkering, that's what I was saying. Like in 2019, I had been tinkering I was actually on Jam Cruise, and we have a bunch of buddies in the music industry, and I was like talking to one of my friends, and she managed a band, and I was like, look, because I really respected her opinion. I was like, I'm thinking about doing like a podcast with these tapes that I have. And she's like, that's a fucking great idea. It'll be amazing.
Yeah.
And
She's
so
right.
she really kind of like fueled the fire a little bit. And and then I'm sitting there like on Netflix, and it was like the night that Berlinger dropped his Bundy tapes on Netflix.
Yeah.
So
I didn't
binged
actually
that.
see
I
that
think it was like 4 or 5 episodes. It might have been 6.
No, it was 8 episodes. It was 8 hours on. I have
Okay.
a personal hatred towards the Netflix docs. I think they're pretty shitty. But the Bundy
Yeah.
one was really shitty, I thought.
It was totally shitty. So,
Yeah.
but I had respected Berlinger for his work on Paradise Lost, like his
Oh,
West
yeah.
Memphis 3
Yeah,
shit.
actually, that was
at
great.
least at the time, like all the shit that came out after the fact, kind of like casted a little bit of a different light on that. But I still respected the work. I thought that he was, in terms of a true crime documentarian, I respected him. So that night, I'm sitting in my room, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to fucking send this guy an email. So I draft up this email, which actually I started posting so that people knew that I wasn't fucking like full of shit. I like posted my pitch to him that I pitched him that night via email, and his response, because I sent him a very long email. I'm like, look, I've got these tapes. Like those tapes that you used for Bundy sucked. They were a bunch of fucking self-serving bullshit from some fucking guy on death row. I'm like, my tapes are tapes of Gacy and his attorney preparing for trial that no one's ever heard. They're fucking amazing. And, so if you're interested, let me know. I was thinking somebody on his staff might, check out the email and get back to me at some point. He hits me back up in 5 minutes. He's like, dude, I am massively interested, and I'm going to fucking circle you in with my producer, Dave. So I then proceed to go 9 months trying to negotiate a deal with these guys for them to license the sound of the tapes. I couldn't get it done, like they just weren't giving me like what I thought the value of them was, because I was like, frankly, looking to try to help out my father financially more than me. And, I just couldn't get them off like 35 grand. I'm like, fucking,
Oh,
They're worth more than that. please.
That was it. Like
Yeah.
that, like I could
Wow.
not get them off that number. Like that was
Wow.
it. So like my dad ends up sending Dave and Joe an email. He's like, "Well, we want $3 million." I was like, "Well, you killed that fucking deal right there, man." I'm like,
I
"That's
don't
that
know if that's
definitely
gonna
killed it."
happen, but come
So
on, at least half a mil.
Totally.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what ends up happening is, like, almost right after that deal died, I got contacted by A&E, who came with a much higher number. It was like, I think like 135 grand.
Okay, a
But
little
it
bit
still
better.
was like, but at that point, I was already kind of obsessed with doing a podcast because I'm like, man, I want to be able to tell the story that I want to tell
Yeah.
and
In
be
your
able
own
to let
way.
people hear the tapes. And so I end up killing that deal as well. And then that's when I hit Darren up and I'm like, yo, I want to do this podcast, man. I've got a pretty good idea on how we should do it. And then we're about I want to say like 3 to 4 weeks into starting to produce the podcast. And the word gets out that Berlinger's doing this fucking documentary, that he is running with
Yeah.
my pitch, and that he's hunted down some other tapes, which he is now, like, if you look at the very first like screen where he's got graphics on there and he's talking about the tapes, he's representing that they're the defense team as if they're like my tapes, and they're just not. Like, those are Karen Conti. Those are, like, because you can hear a woman speaking to Gacy in them, and the only female attorney ever involved in that case was his very last appellate attorney, Karen Conti. So he's misrepresenting what they are. But I didn't even give a shit about any of that, man. I was like,
Yeah.
what I cared about most. And then the guy called his other producer, this guy Ted, hits me up. He's like, "Hey, man," he's like, "I know you're doing the podcast, but like, we really want to have your dad come and interview." I was like, "Well," I said, "Obviously I'm doing my podcast and it's on the same subject matter. So, I mean," I was like, I don't necessarily have a problem with you doing it, because I think anything that happens with Gacy is going to help my pod in terms of Gacy just being out, in the public eye again."
Publicity.
So yeah, and he's like, "Oh, dude," he's like, "I got so many friends in the industry, in the podcast industry. I'm going to fucking hook you up." So I'm like, "All right, man, cool." So I send my dad, I browbeat the fuck out of him to go and do this thing, and he does it. And, of course, Ted doesn't hold up his end of the bargain at all. And, but none of that, like, I didn't give a fuck about any of that. The thing that I cared about is when I discovered that they had planted and fabricated the biggest piece of evidence in that case.
I was going to ask you about this.
Dude. It was mind blowing.
They don't include this in the new documentary, do they? Like,
No,
you've discovered
not only do
this.
they not do they, because that's what my response to him was after I broke the story. I messaged Ted. I'm like, "Look, man, it's like, I don't know how much you have in the can in terms of interviews, but like, you got to fucking scrap it all. Like, we've just changed the narrative of the case, and it's not like theory,
completely.
It's fact.
Yeah,
I have the cops telling me that this was done, that they, that how they got Gacy. It's like, it turned from like a Gacy story into a cop story on like how they were actually able to nab like one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. And they planted the fucking evidence, man. So it was like, he's like, "We have 80% in the can." And he's like, Netflix isn't going to pay for me to refilm it. He's like, "I got to put out the lie," and I'm like, wow. It's like, I lost all fucking respect for you. Like, that's the part that pissed me off.
Typical production supervisor, they got a budget and
Yeah.
they're not going to, they're not going to
They
even
didn't
alter
care.
it for the truth. But that's like one of the, many startling revelations in your podcast is the detectives, the corrupt Chicago cops at the time who were investigating Gacy planted evidence. So
Right.
what did they plant?
So the most famous piece of evidence in the Gacy case, and it wasn't even the Chicago cops, it was Des Plaines.
Oh, Des Plaines.
The Chicago cops, their biggest foible is they didn't give a fuck. They didn't investigate Gacy at all. They could have stopped him right after the third guy was killed if they would have done any amount of police work. Like, so I fucking just roast the Chicago police like completely in my podcast, because they were completely negligent, and it was almost criminal what they were doing. I mean, so their indifference was disgusting. So I end up so essentially the main piece of evidence, and the way that the story goes, and I'll try to thumbnail this for you. So when the last victim goes missing, this great looking kid, Rob Peast, and he goes missing from this pharmacy, it becomes clear to everybody involved, especially the cops and Peast's family, that it was this guy Gacy, because he was the last guy. Like Rob Peace leaves out of the pharmacy saying, Mom, I gotta go talk to this contractor about a job. Everyone knows that guy was Gacy. Gacy had just walked out of the pharmacy. No one saw him get into Gacy's car. No one saw him getting out of his vehicle at Gacy's house. No one, they don't. So beyond just kind of that circumstantial evidence that Rob left the pharmacy at 9 and that they knew that he was going to talk with Gacy at that point, it becomes clear that Gacy's the guy. And then, so they start this 10-day, 24/7 surveillance on Gacy, but they can't get anything. And they originally searched the house the day after Peace goes missing. They get a warrant based on the fact, circumstantially, that it's evident that Peace clearly was with this guy, and now he's vanished off the face of the earth. So they don't find anything on the 13th. So that's where my first red flag flies, because I'm an attorney. I've been doing it for 20 years. I'm a criminal defense guy. I'm looking through the property evidence log, which I was not supposed to have. This thing should have been in the fucking circular file. It should have been like trash, but somehow it still existed. And I don't see this most famous piece of evidence that they have, which is this photo receipt that one of Rob's coworkers claims that she was wearing Rob's coat because it was a brutal winter in Chicago. She worked the register up front. Rob's jacket was sitting right there. She said she put it on because when people would come in and out of the pharmacy, this is pre-revolving doors. Yeah. It was like, the door would open, fucking big cold blast would come in. She's like, it was freezing. So I had Rob's jacket in. And the story was that she had gone back and she had developed film, like old school style, back when we used to have to actually develop shit, it wasn't digital cameras. You had to take a roll of film, you'd put it in an envelope, you'd fill out the envelope, tear off the receipt, and in 2 weeks you come back with your receipt and they give you your pictures, man. So the story was that she had stuck that receipt in Rob's pocket, and that during the search, and then the story became that on the search of the 13th, that they found that photo receipt in John Wayne Gacy's kitchen garbage, which was their direct link that Rob Peace had been in his house, which allowed them to then go and get the second search warrant. Like without that receipt, there is no second search warrant. Without the second search warrant, the federal case that was going to be heard 2 days after Gacy ended up getting arrested, which the entire purpose of that was to stop the surveillance, and he was going to win. Because they had been following him for 10 fucking days and didn't find anything. They had nothing new on him. So that would have killed the investigation. So what you have is a cop who knows that Gacy's the guy. You have a mother in Mrs. Peace that knows Gacy's the guy, and they didn't have the evidence to get him. And at that point, they had no idea he was a serial killer. Yeah. I mean, they may have liked him for like one dude, because they had found the class ring in there that clearly wasn't Peace. And they found a bunch of other weird shit, but they didn't know that he was Gacy. You know what I mean?
He was also wily, like an upstanding member of the community.
Totally.
A children's performer,
dude,
clown.
He was a super success. If you were to put 78 money to 2022 money, guy was probably making $1 million a year. He was super successful at what he was doing, man. And highly respected by everyone in the community. He was the Democratic precinct captain. He was involved, there's that famous picture with him and fucking Rosalind Carter. All that shit exists. I mean, the guy on his face looked like an incredibly upstanding dude, So that's why I'm saying the federal court would have been looking at all that and been like, you've been following this guy 24/7, ruining his fucking business and harassing the fuck out of him. And you've got no evidence. We're shutting it down. Yeah. So they were desperate. And so that's, and on the 19th of December is when the whole plan was hatched. And basically what they do is they go to Kim Byers, who had not put the receipt in Rob's pocket, but had it. And they put together that was how they could get a link between Gacy and Peace. They went to her and said, look, if you want to get the guy that killed your friend, we need that photo receipt. Because they had gone earlier in the day and checked the logbook, because she had told Mrs. Peace a day earlier, because Mrs. Peace is like, I need you to think of every single thing that you can think of. At this point, we're desperate. Every detail, it doesn't matter how small or how big it is, we want to hear it. So Kim tells her, he's like, well, I did develop film. So from her just making that statement, that's where they came with the plan. So they verify in the logbook that she did in fact turn in film. And then they approach her and they say, we just need that receipt. We're going to take care of the rest. And so then it becomes, because and I asked all these cops, I'm like, if you guys had found that receipt in the garbage on the 13th, what would have been the first thing you would have done? Like any cop. Well, that's the pharmacy that the kid went missing from.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a link.
Garbage. We would have gone
It's a
immediately
crucial
to
link.
Nissan Pharmacy to see who the fuck turned the film in. If it's Gacy, not a big deal. If it's Rob Peast, a huge deal. If Kim Byers, huge deal. You know, so and that just never happened. You know, so yeah, it was crazy, dude. Like, I mean, we just changed the narrative of the case, and it's like I'm still waiting for the world to like actually get the story. It's still like, see, like, I mean, our audience is pretty good sized, but it like the story still has not gotten out.
Yeah, I'm
like,
surprised it hasn't broken.
I'm surprised, true crime magazines aren't knocking at your door.
It's because they don't know it exists yet. It's still like it's still a secret. You know, you guys know how it is. It's like my audience is built from social media and me fucking begging people to listen to the show on fucking true crime like Facebook groups and shit.
I mean, that's what happened. Word of mouth. Never know. You never know what could go viral.
Totally.
Wasn't it a risky gambit though? What the police were doing, like, they're trying to find Rob. But if it had come out at the time, wouldn't it have been like a mistrial? And Gacy would have, if they hadn't found bodies,
it would have been way worse than a mistrial. Everything would have been like he would have walked. Yeah. Because remember, it would have been double jeopardy. Yeah. They wouldn't have been able to come back. Like they would have had to have suppressed all the evidence. And like and I go into great detail, like how that works through the legal system with fruit of the poisonous tree, where if they violate somebody's Fourth Amendment rights, which would have been the case, but on top of it, there was police malfeasance and misconduct to the worst extent. Like there's nothing worse than cops planting evidence. It's like abhorred. So like the judge, because I contend that Garippo, who was the trial judge, would have said, fuck you to the cops. He's like, you guys fucked this up. I'm not going to be the asshole that lets this guy walk out the door. I'm going to let the appellate court do it. And he would have kicked it. And the appellate court would have had no choice. Some people have argued, oh, you know, they would have. I'm like, no, they wouldn't have been able to figure it out. It's like once it became clear that the evidence had been planted, there's no figuring it out. And then everything is tossed. Everything before and everything after. So because you have to look at it as a but-for event. But for the warrant getting served and them finding the bones on the 22nd, Gacy is then not giving the statements, the 5 statements where he basically gets them to attribute the 5 bodies in the rivers that they found, you know, because like people were, well, what about the bodies in the river? I'm like, no, man, the only reason they knew about those is because Gacy told them in his confessions after he's arrested, after they found the first bones in his basement, then he starts spilling his guts. All that's gone. So like when we figured it out, we didn't know how to go about it because we figured some people would be like, fuck him, man. It's Gacy. It doesn't fucking matter. He's a fucking piece of shit scumbag. And all that's true, but the Constitution matters. Like it just does. We don't get to pick and choose who the fuck it applies to. It applies to everybody all the time, you know? So, and beyond that, I decided, I'm like, look, we're going to have this. It's a cautionary tale. They were so close to fucking that case up. Like to the extent where Bill Kunkel's having to go to these families and saying like, oh my God, like I'm so sorry that, you know, we fucked this case up. And like, he's literally going to walk, you know, I mean, could you imagine being the lead prosecutor having to tell these families that? Oh my God. He had no idea because he wasn't involved with the case for the first 10 days. That was Terry Sullivan, who of course I could not get on the pod, which now we know why. You know, I could not get Kim Byers on the pod. Like she refused. Like I was trying from the get, which now I know why. Yeah. You know, after we found out the real story, then it made sense why they wouldn't come on. And Kunkel came on. He's like, I don't fuck. He's like, yeah, I'll come on. You know,
what was your father's reaction when you told him this he revelation?
Didn't even understand it. Like he couldn't, like he was having like an incredibly hard time processing what the fuck.
That's mind blowing. Yeah.
So then I literally had to sit down with them and I pulled out the property evidence log. I'm like, Dad, like this is because what I kept saying in the pod when we first discovered is like, how the fuck did my dad miss this?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
I didn't get it. Like I was like, I know my dad to be an amazing fucking attorney and super thorough. I've tried cases with him. I know how his mind works. I know what he does. And it made no sense. And then finally, when I sat him down and we were towards the end of the pod. And I was like, this is the document. I'm like, this is the thing that I keep telling you about. This is the property evidence log from the evidence tech who did not work with Desplaines. He was from Cook County Sheriff Police, completely different agency. So he's the guy that follows the cops around during the first search and writes down everything that they find. Like, so when, you know, God forbid cops ever search your house, they're going to have a guy named, you know, that's going to be an evidence tech, or a girl that's going to be following the cops around with everything they find. If they find something in your garbage, they're going to take a photograph of it. They're going to bag it. They're going to tag it, and they're going to label where it's going to go. Like, that's just how it goes. You're creating the chain of evidence with that, so that, you know, like, and that's done for everybody's benefit. So you know where evidence came from, and everywhere down the road where it's gone and whose hands it's touched, so that you know that it hasn't been tampered with. Because otherwise, without a chain of custody, how the fuck do you know what came
link
from where and who's touched it? And, you know, I mean, it's vital. Like, the whole system falls apart if there's no chain of custody. So I show him this document, and the property seat's not on there because it wasn't there, you know? So, and my dad's like, I never saw this document.
Oh,
so that explained it to me. So, like, it was as simple as, because the way it works is, when the cops are doing their investigation, they're creating reports after the fact. All right. So, like, they go out, they do a search, they take notes, or if they're doing a witness interview, they take notes. And at some point, they memorialize it in a police report. And at some point, if somebody's arrested, those police reports get tendered to the state's attorney. And then the state's attorney then goes through them with a fine-tooth comb. And ultimately, those are handed over to the defense in discovery. All right. So what happened here is, Cook County Sheriff's Police, when they sent their reports to Des Plaines, because they didn't send their reports to the state's attorney, they sent them to the agency that they were assisting, which was Des Plaines. Kozenzak, the lieutenant, the obsessed cop, just pulled his fucking report right out, because he had already prepared his own property evidence sheet.
Wow.
Where he injects the photo receipt and says, and he claims in his book, like I was trying not to use any second source material, but I had to use Kozenzak's book because he's dead.
yeah.
And, like, in his book, he claims, he's like, I personally, the only piece of evidence that I found in the entire case was the photo receipt shining like a piece of gold in Gacy's fucking kitchen garbage.
Yeah. It's
and I'm like, dude, it was insane.
Too good to be
So
true.
I was like, so ultimately I finally got my father to understanding it. And he was like, holy shit, man. You know?
I mean, yeah,
it's like, it was
changes the whole
crazy,
case.
man. I mean, it's such a narrative. Like I've never heard of like such an old case that's been like, you know, 50 documentaries and books.
I was about to say, analyzed
all this
so
shit.
heavily.
It's like, to uncover something like
Yeah.
that was just crazy to me. So
Blows
I'm still
my
blown
mind.
away by it.
One of the things I really love about your podcast is how much you're revealing about, like, the victims, and especially, like, unknown stuff about the victims too.
That was the thing, Kate. I was like, going in, I'm like, I am not making this fucking thing about Gacy. It's like, that's been done ad nauseum. I'm sick of hearing all that shit. It's like everything is like a long news article about Gacy. He lived in Iowa. He owned the fucking, he was managing Kentucky Fried Chickens. He got the sod. It's like the same shit over and over. I'm like, no. It's like, you know what I've never heard about in the 40 years, and I'm close to the case, is the fucking victims. I don't know anything about any of these victims except for Robert Piest.
Yeah.
So we went in with a concerted effort that we were going to really, really focus on the victims finally. And it so happened that we were probably about 15 episodes in when I found out that another Chicago cat named David Nelson had been working on this book for like 8 years called Boys Entered the House. And it was fucking amazing. Like, cause it was all about the victims. He was like, he had the same idea, but he had been working on it for a decade, like interviewing like all the living family members of all the victims that he could find to finally tell their story. So I immediately hunt this guy down. I'm like, dude, I'm doing in my pod what like you just did in your book, and I will promote the fuck out of your book on my pod. But I want some of those stories for the pod, man. And he was kind enough to allow me to draw from some of his materials, because it was very important to me to memorialize who these kids were, man, because it's just never been done. And it's like 33 lives lost, man.
And they were just
when you
kids.
Spider web that out,
Yeah.
is like just thousands and thousands of people that have been affected by those kids being murdered.
Largely nameless. Like, people don't even know who these victims are.
Yeah.
For the most part.
And some of them are still unidentified. Do you think
correct?
Is it 4 now? There's still, because I know in October of 2021 they identified one of them. So is there 4 to go?
Right. There's 5. There's 5 left. So
5.
yeah, like Francis Alexander was like the most recent one. And like immediately, like, so Darren and I snuck into that press, like that when they identified the body and they made the announcement that they identified a Gacy. Like, so I snuck in with my producer into that press conference because I'm like, I'm asking questions, you know, I'm getting into this fucking thing because I'm like actually the only person that's actually talking about these victims. So we get in there, and you know, I immediately go up to the girl from her name's Karen Binder, fucking great chick, and she works with DNA Dope Project. And I'm like, you guys do fucking amazing work. Like I'm just like blown away by what you guys do, because they do the genealogical DNA stuff, like where it's like they're taking family trees and mixing it with DNA. It's like fucking like the coolest sleuthing shit that I've ever heard of. And like I'm like a huge fan of the work that they do, and it's super important shit, man. It's like, so I told her, I was like, I need you on my podcast. I need you to explain what you guys do. And I want, you know, I want you guys getting some publicity in my pod, because your work's super important. And I think that people need to be aware of what you're doing, because they're, you know, they're a not-for-profit, man, you know, so they rely on the
exposure.
generosity
Yeah,
of us, you know, as citizens to fucking help fund them. So, and she was awesome. And she just fucking crushed it, explaining how they do it. And, you know, so I end up going back to the Cook County Sheriff, who's handling like the unidentified victims. I'm like, why the fuck haven't you just handed over everything? Because they can use trace DNA now. They don't need like they can use a completely degraded DNA sample and get it done. And I'm like, why are you sitting on these fucking these five unidentified victims, you know, samples? Like, why don't you just turn them all over? Like, why are you slow playing this? I don't get it. So, you know, and I was shitty like that about it, because it's fucking irritating to me. So, you know, like, what we're gonna end up doing is we're doing a part 2 to Gacy.
that's great,
because we believe there's more victims that were not only unidentified, but more victims out there, and we think that we know where they are. And so, like, I created like this incredible relationship with this old Chicago cop who was like, if like all cops were like this guy Bill Dorsch, like we'd be living in a much different society. Like, this guy was like literally like a good guy cop, like fucking clean. He's just a fucking amazing guy. And like he got run out of the police force for a multitude of reasons. It was all because he was a good cop. You know, it was like he was exposed. He was like a whistleblower type guy. Like, these guys are, you know, he'd be like, these guys are fucking pieces of shit. And so he was whistleblowing on cops. So obviously they ran him out of the business, and he's like literally living in Bulgaria right now. You know, but he reached out to me during the pod, and he's like, I fucking love your podcast, man. He's like, I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for 20 years for somebody to actually do what you're doing. So he's going to be my fucking right hand on this whole second season,
great.
With us uncovering everything we can about that
so
case.
Is the second season going to get more into the theory that Gacy basically had accomplices?
Totally. I mean, look, I'm very clear on the pod that Rossi and Cram were complicit with him. You know? I mean, like I mince no words. Like everyone else has been afraid to talk about Mike Rossi. Like in 2 of the books that were written, like they used pseudonyms for the guy, because apparently his grandfather was a guy named Vito Marzullo, who was Old Man Daly, the original Daly, the fucking Democratic machine Daly back in the
mayor
70s, you know.
Yeah,
Mayor Daly,
Mayor
who
Daley
fucking was the most powerful Democratic mayor in the country at the time. Apparently Mike Rossi's grandfather was his right-hand man. So he was protected to the extent where no one was going to fuck with them. So we don't give a fuck, and we're gonna fuck with them. Like we called him. He's like, yeah, I want 50 grand. I'm like, you think I'm gonna pay you 50 grand for you to come on my podcast and deny everything?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, fuck you, man.
And there was a pedophile ring at the time, wasn't there, in Chicago, that Gacy was involved with?
Totally. I mean, because like, so when we started the pod, Tracy Ullman, who had dropped The Devil in Disguise like the year before on Peacock, and she has always been of the mindset that Gacy was part of a much bigger child sex trafficking ring. Like, that has always been her thing. Because you have this John David Norman guy who was like a known child trafficker back then. Like
pedophile.
They walked into, dude, like he was a fucked up cat. And they like when he was arrested, they found like 30 filing cabinets that had like filled front to back with like dossiers of kids that they were trafficking. So like this guy was like an arch fucking criminal. So Tracy has always been, and he was a Chicago guy. And then there's this other link to this guy named Phil Paskey, who's dead now. And Phil Paskey was a right-hand man of John David Norman. And then you've got David Cram, who was fucking one of Gacy's little lackeys. You have Mike Rossi and David Cram. Cram and Paskey had a known relationship.
Yeah.
In terms of like fucking with each other. So like you have these like incredibly close links. And like I was telling Tracy, I'm like, the problem, it's like, I'm not discrediting that as a theory, but the problem is I'm like super fact driven. And I don't know that there's going to be any way that I can ever prove that, in terms of him being a part of that sex trafficking ring. Whereas as far as Rossi goes, man, you can't, like, both Cram and Rossi. So Gacy's most, at least that we know of, his most active period in killing was like 77 to 78, like from mid 76. Like as soon as he divorced his wife, Carol, and she was out of the house, he fucking went nuts.
Oh,
like,
he did.
He killed like 22 of them from that. Like
sometimes two in one evening.
Now he's got the house to himself,
Right.
Why
exactly.
not?
It's a fucking free for all up in there. Well, we say he has the house to himself, but the reality is that Rossi lived with him for 4 of the months, and then Cram lived with him separately after Rossi moved out for another. So during his most active killing period, these two fucking guys lived in the house with him. And Gacy always killed at night. Like he was fucking like he was going out and trolling at 1 a.m, and his kill time was like 4 to 5 a.m. So he'd get them back to the house. They'd get fucked up, and he'd either kill them and then have sex with them, or get them constrained with the rope trick, or the handcuff trick, and then have sex with them and then kill them. So it was like there's just a 0% chance that I think it's beyond that. Like I think that Cram and Rossi actually were beyond complicit in not just that they were accomplices. I think that there are probably a few victims that they actually killed themselves.
Do you think justice was served by Gacy's execution?
Absolutely.
And do you recall when
I've always said that he was the post, like I'm an anti-death penalty guy, in general, because I think that, basically we're lowering ourselves to the level of the killers by, just killing them. But, in terms of if anybody deserved the death penalty, that fucking guy did. Cause like, to me, he was the scariest motherfucker on the planet. Because like you could talk about BTK and Ted Bundy. None of them were as normalized as Gacy was.
Completely.
Like none of them were. Like this guy was like super stealth because he on his face was so fucking normal. And he just had this like alter ego, like this fucking dark
terrifying
side that was beyond.
Yeah.
The guy was like an apex predator, like of the worst kind.
Do you recall when he was executed?
I do. It was actually, oddly enough, it was May 10th of 1994, which he ended up not getting executed until like after the clock struck midnight. So it was actually May 11th, which happens to be my father's birthday. So
wow,
there was a bit of irony in that.
Yeah.
And my dad did not go.
I was wondering if your father attended.
My old man were invited to the execution, and my dad's like, that's, as horrible as he was, he's my client. I'm not going to go watch them fucking execute my client, because from a defense attorney's perspective, deserved or not, they had a job to do. And I think that,
I respect
my father, as much as he hated Gacy, he also believed that he was sick, and that it was a compulsion, that he couldn't control himself and he couldn't comport to the law. I think my father believed that, and frankly, out of anybody on the planet that would know that, it would probably be him, because he spent more time with Gacy, where Gacy was quasi confessing to what he had been doing. You know what I mean? It's like, aside from the psychiatrist that they hired in order to, put forward the insanity defense, who spent, 50, 60, 70, 80 hours with them, but Gacy always had an agenda there. Like Gacy was a smart fucking guy.
Oh yeah.
And he was always trying to be the smartest guy in the room, because he always thought he was the smartest guy in the room, so he always played that game.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It was an interesting case, man. It was like, we got one review with some woman. She's like, I love the podcast until like Bob said that he like actually believed that he was insane. I was like, well, number one, I never said that, but And number two, I mean, it's disingenuous for any of us to sit there, like, because it's different thinking, did he get what he deserved? Yes. But can we really say that he wasn't broken in some way? I mean, it's just not, you're not being a genuine person if you're saying that there wasn't something massively
Exactly.
fucked up with that guy.
Oh, there was,
Yeah.
yeah.
Bob,
Yeah.
I admire your show because you're doing something different. You're rewriting the narrative, and I don't think anyone's done
Appreciate that. I
and
appreciate that, man.
we're looking forward to part 2. So people check out the Defense Diaries podcast on any of the podcast listening platforms. You can also go to defensediariespodcast.com. Bob, we'll put up a link for sure. Thanks for being on the show, man.
Dude, thanks for having me and thanks for letting me ramble because, like I can go for hours. So
Oh, I love
It's
it.
fascinating. Yeah.
without letting you guys get a word in edgewise. So I appreciate
No, I
the
love
time,
it.
man. And I appreciate y'all listening to the show as well.
All right. Thanks a lot, and have a great Memorial Day.
You too, man. Stay safe.